I brought my boyfriend home for Christmas, and my family destroyed everything in 10 seconds. The driveway was already packed when we pulled up. My stomach twisted seeing Uncle Greg's Mercedes next to my sister's Range Rover. I'd specifically told my mother we'd arrive at 2, that I wanted time to settle in before the chaos started. But there were at least 8 cars here, which meant she'd invited people early without telling me. Classic manipulation. Make me look like the one disrupting her perfect schedule. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand, his fingers warm against my cold ones. It's going to be fine, Lily. They're going to love you. I wanted to believe him, but he didn't understand what he was walking into. How could he? His family had game nights and inside jokes. Mine had scorecards and blood debts. I'd been preparing him for weeks, trying to explain the ecosystem of my family without making them sound completely toxic. My mother, Helen, who measured love in achievements and appearances. My father, Richard, whose silence somehow carried more judgment than words. My older sister, Natalie, who'd spent 30 years perfecting the art of making me feel small. My younger brother, Derek, who'd learned early that staying neutral kept him safe. And then there were the extended relatives, each with their own agendas and alliances, all orbiting around the central sun of my mother's approval. Daniel had listened patiently, dismissing my concerns with optimism that felt increasingly naive the closer we got to the house. The front door opened before we reached it. My mother stood framed in the entrance, wearing a silk blouse and pearls at 2 in the afternoon. Her hair was freshly styled, her makeup flawless. She looked exactly like she always did, perfect and cold as porcelain. There you are. We were starting to wonder if you'd gotten lost. Her voice carried that particular edge that meant I was already disappointing her. I checked my phone. We were exactly on time. Come in! Come in! Everyone's been dying to meet Daniel. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like Chanel and champagne, then turned her full attention to him. I watched her eyes sweep over him, cataloging everything. His jeans were dark and clean but not designer. His sweater was nice but off-brand. His shoes were practical. I could see her making calculations behind her smile. Inside, the house looked like a magazine spread. My mother had outdone herself this year, with fresh garland wrapped around the staircase, a massive tree in the living room dripping with ornaments that matched the rest of the decor, and what looked like professional floral arrangements on every surface. The air smelled like cinnamon and pine, and the particular kind of stress that comes from trying to manufacture perfection. Voices echoed from the great room where I could hear my sister's laugh, that specific performance she did when she wanted everyone to know she was having the best time. My chest tightened. We weren't even through the door, and I already wanted to leave. The introductions happened in a blur of handshakes and air kisses. My father barely looked up from his phone, giving Daniel a brief nod before returning to whatever was more important. Natalie swept in wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her 2 perfectly behaved children trailing behind her like accessories. So this is the famous Daniel. Lily's told us absolutely nothing about you. She laughed like this was charming instead of a pointed reminder that I didn't share things with them anymore. Her husband Kenneth appeared with drinks, playing the generous host in my parents' house, a power move I recognized immediately. Uncle Greg and Aunt Diane were there, along with my mother's college friend Patricia and her husband. My cousin Jeremy stood by the fireplace looking uncomfortable. Derek was nowhere to be seen, probably hiding upstairs until dinner made his presence mandatory. Daniel handled it beautifully, I had to admit. He asked my father about his law practice, complimented Natalie's kids, made appropriate small talk about the weather and traffic. He was good at this, at sliding into new social situations and finding common ground. It was one of the things I loved about him, that easy confidence that came from growing up in a family where people actually liked each other. But I could see my family dissecting him with every word, every gesture. They were trying to figure out what I saw in him, trying to identify his weaknesses so they could exploit them later. It was what they did. It was what they'd always done. My mother guided us toward the great room where she'd set up a bar cart and appetizer spread that could have catered a wedding. She pressed a glass of wine into my hand before I could refuse, then immediately began asking Daniel questions that sounded casual, but weren't. Where did he grow up? What did his parents do? Where did he go to school? Each answer was weighed and measured against their standards. His parents ran a small bookstore in Vermont. He'd gone to a state university on partial scholarship. He worked as a graphic designer for a mid-sized marketing firm. Nothing wrong with any of it, but nothing impressive enough for the Hartleys, who measured worth in Ivy League degrees and 6-figure salaries. Natalie positioned herself on the couch where she could maintain visual control of the room. Daniel, what a unique career choice. Do you enjoy the creative field? Her tone made it sound like she'd asked if he enjoyed collecting trash. Her husband Kenneth worked in private equity. She never let anyone forget it. It must be so freeing not to worry about things like quarterly earnings or market performance. Daniel smiled, either not catching the condescension or choosing to ignore it. I really do. I get to solve problems creatively every day. Plus, the work-life balance lets me actually have a life, which is nice. I loved him for that response, for refusing to apologize for having priorities beyond accumulating wealth. But I saw my mother's expression tighten almost imperceptibly. Work-life balance was code for lack of ambition in her world. Real success meant sacrifice. meant working 80-hour weeks and missing your kids' childhoods in pursuit of partnership or CEO positions. My father had built his firm that way. Natalie had climbed the corporate ladder at her consulting company with the same ruthless focus before having kids and pivoting to being a full-time mother who treated parenting like a competitive sport. Even Derek, who I'd thought might escape, had gone into investment banking and adopted the same workaholic martyrdom. I was the outlier, the disappointment, the one who'd chosen teaching because I actually wanted to help people instead of maximizing profit margins. We'd been there maybe 30 minutes when Derek finally appeared, looking harried and checking his phone obsessively. He hugged me briefly, shook Daniel's hand, then immediately got pulled into a conversation with Uncle Greg about some deal they were working on together. I watched him slip back into the family persona, the shrewd businessman nephew who'd learned to play the game. We used to be close, Derek and I. We used to text each other from family gatherings, making jokes about the absurdity of it all. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped fighting it. He'd decided it was easier to become what they wanted than to maintain his own identity. I'd watched it happen gradually, then suddenly, and now he barely resembled the brother I'd grown up with. Patricia, my mother's friend, cornered us near the appetizers. Your mother tells me you two met online? How modern. The way she said it made online dating sound like something slightly shameful, desperate even. We actually met through mutual friends, I corrected, though I wasn't sure why I bothered. Patricia would remember whatever version served her narrative best. That's wonderful. And Daniel, what brings you to Boston? Family here? He explained that he'd moved for work 3 years ago, that he loved the city, had built a good community. Patricia nodded with that fixed smile older women used when they were pretending to listen while actually judging. That's brave, starting over somewhere new without roots. Though I suppose some people are more comfortable being unattached. The comments kept coming, small cuts disguised as curiosity. How long had we been dating? 8 months. Oh, still quite new then. Where did we see ourselves in 5 years? Building our careers, maybe traveling. How practical, though, don't wait too long to settle down. Did we want children? We hadn't really decided. How modern, though family is so important. Each question was a trap, each answer ammunition for later discussions about my choices, my relationship, my failure to meet their expectations. Daniel handled it with grace I didn't deserve, answering honestly while somehow not giving them anything they could weaponize. But I could feel the walls closing in, that suffocating feeling that always came from being in this house with these people. My mother announced that dinner would be at 6, which meant we had 3 more hours of this performance. 3 more hours of watching my family pick apart everything about Daniel and me, looking for weaknesses, comparing us to Natalie and Kenneth's picture-perfect life. I excused myself to use the bathroom, needing a moment to breathe, to regroup. The downstairs bathroom was decorated like everything else, with matching hand towels and fancy soap and a candle burning that probably cost more than a week's groceries. I stared at myself in the mirror, at the tension around my eyes, the fake smile that had worn itself into my face. Why did I keep doing this? Why did I keep bringing people I loved into this environment, hoping it would be different? When I came out, I found Daniel in the hallway looking at family photos my mother had arranged with museum-level precision, pictures of Natalie's wedding, her kids' professional portraits, Derek at his college graduation. Notably fewer of me. The ones that existed showed me at various ages, always slightly separate from the rest of the family, always looking like I wasn't sure I belonged in the frame. You were a cute kid, Daniel said, pointing to one where I was maybe 7, gap-toothed and uncertain. You still have that same thoughtful look in your eyes. I loved that he saw thoughtful instead of anxious, that he could look at these curated images and not see what I saw, which was evidence of my perpetual outsider status. The afternoon dragged on with the particular torture of forced socialization. Uncle Greg held court discussing real estate investments and market trends, speaking with the authority of someone who'd never been told he was wrong about anything. Aunt Diane talked about their recent trip to Tuscany, making sure everyone knew they'd stayed in a private villa, not some common hotel. Kenneth described his firm's latest acquisition like he was narrating an action movie. Natalie managed to work her children's achievements into every conversation, their test scores and athletic abilities and gifted program placements. My mother orchestrated it all, guiding conversations, refreshing drinks, ensuring everyone stayed positioned exactly where she wanted them in the social hierarchy she'd constructed. I tried to engage, to participate in this performance I'd been rehearsing my whole life, but everything felt hollow, scripted. Daniel fit surprisingly well into it all, or at least he seemed to. He laughed at Uncle Greg's stories, asked questions about Natalie's kids' schools, complimented the house and the decorations, but I kept catching these moments where he'd look at me with slight confusion, like he was recalibrating his understanding of who I was based on this environment I'd come from. I wanted to pull him aside and explain that this wasn't real, that these weren't my people, that I'd spent my entire adult life trying to escape this performative hell. But how do you explain that the people who are supposed to love you most actually just see you as a supporting character in their own narratives? Around 5, my mother herded everyone toward the dining room to see the table she'd spent days preparing. It looked like something from a magazine, with fine china and crystal and a centerpiece that probably cost more than my car payment. Name cards marked each seat, and I felt my stomach drop seeing where she'd positioned us. Daniel and I were separated, him between Natalie and Patricia, me between my father and Uncle Greg. Strategic placement designed to prevent us from supporting each other, to ensure we'd each be interrogated independently. My mother smiled at her creation, pleased with herself, oblivious or indifferent to how this seating arrangement felt like a deliberate act of hostility. Derek pulled me aside while everyone else admired the table. Mom's in rare form today. His voice was low, careful. Just be careful, okay? She's been weird about you bringing Daniel. She keeps making comments. I wanted to ask what kind of comments, but I could guess. Comments about how I could do better. Comments about how he wasn't impressive enough. Comments about how this relationship was another example of me settling, of not living up to my potential, of disappointing them. Why didn't you warn me? I asked, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. Derek looked uncomfortable. I tried. I texted you last week that maybe you should wait until Easter, but you said you wanted to do this. He was right. I had said that, because I'd convinced myself that introducing Daniel would force my family to see me differently, to recognize that I'd built a life and relationship that made me happy even if it didn't meet their criteria for success. I'd thought that bringing him here would be a statement, a line drawn in the sand. Instead, I just handed them new ammunition and put someone I cared about in their crosshairs. Just get through dinner, Derek advised. Then you can say you're tired and leave early. That's what I do. The fact that his survival strategy involved minimizing contact with our own family said everything about how dysfunctional this all was. We reconvened in the living room for pre-dinner drinks, because apparently, 3 hours of day drinking wasn't enough. My father finally engaged, asking Daniel questions about his work with the detached interest of someone conducting a job interview for a position they'd already decided not to fill. What software did he use? What were his typical project timelines? What was his long-term career trajectory? Daniel answered each question thoughtfully, professionally, not realizing he was being evaluated and found wanting. My father's follow-up questions got increasingly pointed, focused on earnings potential and advancement opportunities, things that mattered to him and not at all to Daniel. Natalie jumped in with her own interrogation disguised as curiosity. Daniel, do you think you'll always want to work in-house, or do you have ambitions to start your own agency? Kenneth started his firm at 32, which has been incredibly rewarding, both financially and professionally. The comparison was deliberate. Kenneth had built something. Daniel was just an employee. Kenneth was an entrepreneur, a risk-taker, a leader. Daniel was playing it safe. The subtext screamed loud enough to hurt. Daniel, to his credit, didn't take the bait. I like the stability of working with an established company. It lets me focus on the creative work instead of the business side. But who knows what the future holds? My mother chose that moment to make her announcement. Everyone, if we could gather around, I have something exciting to share. She positioned herself at the center of the room, pulling Natalie close. As you all know, Natalie and Kenneth have been such wonderful parents, and they've decided to give their children the ultimate gift. She paused for effect, her smile brilliant and brittle. They're having another baby, due in June. The room erupted in congratulations and excited chatter. Natalie beamed, accepting hugs and well wishes. Kenneth stood behind her looking proud and proprietary. My mother was practically glowing with satisfaction. I felt like I'd been punched. Not because I wasn't happy for Natalie, though honestly I wasn't sure I was, but because of the timing, the staging, the way my mother had clearly known about this and had orchestrated this entire gathering as a celebration that I'd walked into blindly. This wasn't about Christmas. This was about Natalie's achievement, another milestone that would highlight everything I hadn't done. Another opportunity for my mother to point out, subtly or not, that my sister had figured out life while I was still stumbling around making questionable choices, like dating a man whose parents owned a bookstore. My mother pulled me into the celebration circle, her arm around my shoulders feeling more like a restraint than an embrace. Isn't it wonderful? 3 children, and Natalie's handling it all so beautifully, managing to keep up her consulting work from home. She's such an inspiration. I made appropriate congratulatory sounds, hugged my sister, said all the right things, but I could feel something cracking inside me, that careful control I'd maintained since arriving starting to fracture. Daniel found his way to my side, his presence grounding me slightly. He leaned in and whispered, "You okay?" I nodded, lying, because what else could I do? The dinner bell, an actual silver bell my mother rang like we were in some period drama, summoned us to the table. We found our assigned seats, and I immediately understood the full extent of my mother's tactical planning. Not only was I separated from Daniel, but I was positioned where I'd have to watch him be interrogated while being unable to intervene. Natalie sat directly across from me, her pregnancy glow and smug satisfaction impossible to ignore. My father was to my right, Uncle Greg to my left. Daniel was surrounded by the women, my mother at the head of the table positioned perfectly to orchestrate the entire meal. The first course appeared, some elaborate soup that required specific spoons and technique to eat properly. My mother launched into hostess mode, ensuring everyone had what they needed while simultaneously managing to direct every conversation. She asked Patricia about her daughter's engagement, sympathized about wedding planning stress, then smoothly pivoted. Speaking of weddings, Daniel, Do you have any siblings? Are any of them married? It seemed like an innocent question. It wasn't. Daniel explained he had a younger sister who was still in graduate school. How nice that she's prioritizing her education. Though there's something to be said for starting families young, isn't there? More energy for children. Patricia picked up the thread. Absolutely. I had my daughter at 26, which people thought was late back then. But now it seems everyone's waiting until their 30s or even 40s. Though biologically speaking, there are consequences to that delay. She looked at me meaningfully. I was 29. The implication was clear. Natalie added her voice to the chorus. I'm so glad Kenneth and I didn't wait. We got married at 25. Had our first at 27. It's made everything easier, getting the childbearing years done while we're young. Kenneth nodded agreement, his hand possessively on Natalie's shoulder. Plus, the kids will be launched before we're 50. We'll still have time to enjoy our lives after parenting. I felt Daniel's eyes on me from across the table, his confusion evident. We'd talked about kids in abstract terms. Eventually, maybe, when we were ready. We'd never discussed timelines or biological clocks, or whether my worth as a woman was determined by my reproductive choices. But here was my family, discussing my fertility like it was public domain, using my uterus as a conversation piece. I gripped my fork tighter, focusing on my soup, trying to breathe through the rage building in my chest. My father shifted beside me. Your mother and I were 24 when we got married. Different generation, I suppose. People knew what they wanted and went for it. Uncle Greg joined in, because apparently everyone needed to weigh in on my reproductive timeline. My generation didn't overthink everything the way young people do now. You met someone suitable, you got married, you had kids. All this soul-searching and finding yourself, it just leads to paralysis by analysis. He looked at Daniel. What's your take on all this, son? You thinking about settling down anytime soon? The question hung there like a trap. If Daniel said yes, they'd pry into why he hadn't proposed yet. If he said no, they'd paint him as commitment-phobic and me as wasting my time. Either way, we lost. Daniel set down his spoon carefully. Lily and I are very happy with where we are. We're building something solid, getting to know each other deeply before making big decisions. I think that's responsible, not overthinking. I loved him for trying to defend us, but I also knew it wouldn't matter. My mother smiled that thin smile that never reached her eyes. Of course, dear. Though 8 months is quite a bit of time to spend getting to know someone. Richard and I were engaged after 3 months. When you know, you know. She said it like a truth, not an opinion. Like their timeline was the only correct one, and any deviation indicated flaws in the relationship or the people in it. The interrogation continued through the main course. They asked about his family's bookstore, managing to make it sound quaint and unsuccessful, even though it had been a community staple for decades. They asked about his apartment, expressing surprise he still rented at 31 instead of building equity. They asked about his hobbies, his interests, his plans, each question designed to highlight how he didn't measure up to their standards. And through it all, Daniel remained calm and genuine, answering honestly, not realizing that honesty was being used as a weapon against him, against us. I tried to participate in the other conversations happening around the table, but I couldn't focus. Uncle Greg was talking about portfolio diversification. Aunt Diane was describing their plans to buy a vacation home in Charleston. Kenneth was holding forth about cryptocurrency investments. All these markers of wealth and success. All these ways of demonstrating that they'd won at life while implying everyone else was losing. I pushed food around my plate, my appetite gone, my jaw aching from clenching it so tight. Then Natalie asked the question I'd been dreading. So Daniel, tell us about your family. Your parents own a bookstore, right? That must be interesting. Do they make a decent living from that? Her tone was innocently curious, but the emphasis on decent living betrayed her real question. Were his parents successful enough to have raised him properly? Could they afford the kind of lifestyle the Hartleys considered acceptable? Was his entire background too working class for their precious daughter? Daniel didn't flinch. They do well. They love what they do, and they've built something meaningful in their community. Not everyone measures success purely financially. The silence that followed felt dangerous. I watched my family process what Daniel had just said, the implicit criticism of their value system. My mother's smile froze. My father stopped cutting his meat. Natalie looked genuinely shocked that someone had dared to suggest their priorities might be misguided. Kenneth's expression darkened. Uncle Greg actually scoffed. And I knew in that moment that Daniel had crossed a line he didn't even know existed. You could think the Hartleys were shallow and materialistic. You just couldn't say it out loud. My mother recovered first because she always did. Of course not, dear. But financial stability does provide security and opportunities. I'm sure your parents are lovely people, but let's be honest about the realities of modern life. Money might not buy happiness, but it certainly makes unhappiness more comfortable. She laughed lightly, as if she'd made a joke instead of a pronouncement. The others joined in with that forced laughter that meant they agreed but were pretending to be polite. Daniel's face remained neutral, but I saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. He was starting to understand what he'd walked into. The meal continued with increasing tension. Every conversation felt like a minefield. My mother asked about our living situation, her eyebrows raising when she learned Daniel had a one-bedroom apartment. Natalie mentioned her house's recent renovation, the cost of which exceeded Daniel's annual salary. Patricia brought up her daughter's engagement ring, making sure everyone knew it was 3 carats. Kenneth described his car as if vehicle choice was a moral indicator, and through it all, they kept circling back to Daniel, probing for weaknesses, comparing him to their standards, and finding him lacking. I'd stopped eating entirely. My stomach was twisted in knots, my hands shaking slightly as I reached for my wine glass. Derek caught my eye from across the table, his expression sympathetic but helpless. He'd tried to warn me. He'd told me this was a bad idea, but I'd been stubborn, convinced I could make this work, that love would somehow be enough to bridge the gap between my family's world and the life I'd chosen to build. I'd been wrong, so catastrophically wrong. Dessert appeared, some elaborate creation my mother had special ordered from her favorite bakery. As we ate, the conversation shifted to upcoming events. Natalie's baby shower in February, Kenneth's firm's annual gala in March, Easter plans, summer vacations, a calendar of obligations and performances, each one an opportunity to demonstrate status and belonging. My mother turned to me finally, her focus landing like a spotlight. "Lily, you've been so quiet. Is everything all right? You've barely touched your food." Her concern was performative, a way to draw attention to my obvious discomfort and make it my fault. "I'm fine, just tired from the drive." The lie came easily. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. "Of course. Well, we're all just so happy you finally brought someone to meet us. We'd started to worry you'd given up on finding someone suitable." The word suitable hung in the air like an accusation. She continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Though I have to say, Daniel isn't quite what we'd pictured for you. Not that there's anything wrong with him, of course. He's very nice, just different from what we'd imagined." I felt the blood drain from my face. She'd said it, out loud, in front of everyone. The thing that had been implied all evening, she'd made explicit. Daniel set down his fork carefully. "I'm sorry to hear I'm not what you pictured, Mrs. Hartley, but I love your daughter, and I'd like to think that matters more than whether I fit some predetermined image." His voice was calm, but I heard the edge in it. The other conversations had stopped. Everyone was watching now, sensing blood in the water. My mother's smile didn't waver. "Of course it matters, dear. Love is wonderful. But love doesn't pay bills or provide the kind of life Lily grew up with. She's used to certain standards, certain expectations. I'm just not sure a graphic designer can maintain those." The room erupted, not in my defense, but in agreement. Natalie jumped in immediately. "Mom's just being practical. It's not personal, Daniel. We just want what's best for Lily." Uncle Greg added his voice. "The man should be able to provide. That's basic biology, basic society. If you can't offer her the life she deserves, what exactly are you offering?" Kenneth, never missing an opportunity to assert his superiority, leaned forward. "I had to prove myself to this family too. I worked 80-hour weeks, made partner by 35, bought Natalie her dream house. That's what it takes to earn your place here." I stood up so abruptly my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood. Every eye turned to me. "Stop. Just stop talking." My voice came out shaky but loud enough to cut through the noise. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to sit here and evaluate him like he's applying for a position at your firm. He's not auditioning for your approval." My mother's expression shifted to disappointed concern. "Lily, sweetheart, sit down. You're being dramatic." But I couldn't sit down. I couldn't stay in this room another second listening to these people I shared DNA with tear apart someone I loved. "No, I'm not being dramatic. I'm being honest, which is apparently a foreign concept in this family. You've spent the entire evening trying to humiliate him, to point out every way he doesn't meet your arbitrary standards. But you know what? He's kinder and more genuine than anyone at this table. He actually cares about things that matter instead of measuring his worth by his bank account and his car and his house size. And you can't stand that because it highlights how empty all of this is." I gestured around the room, at the expensive decorations and fine china and curated perfection. All of this performance, this constant competition, this need to prove you're better than everyone else. It's exhausting and it's toxic. My father stood now, his voice carrying that authority he used in courtrooms. "That's enough. You're out of line and you're embarrassing yourself." I laughed, but it came out bitter. "I'm embarrassing myself? I'm not the one who spent dinner interrogating my daughter's boyfriend like he's on trial. I'm not the one who announced someone else's pregnancy to steal focus from any other event. I'm not the one who just told the man I love that he's not good enough in front of a room full of people." I turned to Daniel, who'd stood beside me. "I'm so sorry. I never should have brought you here. This was a mistake." My mother's voice went cold. "If you walk out that door right now, Lily, you're making a choice. You're choosing him over your family, over everything we've given you, everything we've built. Is that really what you want?" The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade. Choose them or choose him. Stay and accept their judgment or leave and lose them. Except it wasn't really a choice because I'd already lost them years ago. I'd just been too afraid to admit it. These people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had made their love contingent on my compliance, on my willingness to pretend their way was the only way. "Yes," I said simply. "That's what I want." Because he's not asking me to choose. He's not demanding I fit into some predetermined mold or meet impossible standards. He loves me for who I am, not for who he wishes I could be. I looked at each of them. These people I'd spent my life trying to please, trying to impress, trying to earn love from. You've never accepted me. Not really. I'm the daughter who didn't go into law or business, who didn't marry someone impressive enough, who didn't produce grandchildren on your timeline. I've always been the disappointment, the black sheep, and I'm done apologizing for it. Natalie spoke up, her voice dripping with false concern. Lily, you're overreacting. We're just looking out for you. We don't want to see you struggle or settle for less than you deserve. I turned to her. This sister who'd spent our entire lives competing with me, needing to win at everything. I'm not settling, Natalie. I'm choosing. There's a difference. Just because my life doesn't look like yours doesn't mean it's less valuable. Just because I prioritize different things doesn't make me wrong. You've always needed to be better than me, to prove you're the successful one. Congratulations. You win. But I'm done playing this game. Derek stood up, and for a moment I thought he might defend me. Instead, he tried to play mediator. Everyone just calm down. Let's take a breath and talk about this rationally. But there was nothing rational about this situation. There was nothing to mediate. These weren't misunderstandings or miscommunications. This was fundamental incompatibility. Years of resentment and judgment finally exploding into the open. I shook my head at Derek. Don't. Just don't. You've chosen to stay in this system, to play by their rules. That's your choice, but it's not mine anymore. Uncle Greg stood, his face red with indignation. You ungrateful little girl. After everything this family has done for you, this is how you repay them? By throwing a tantrum because we asked legitimate questions about your boyfriend's ability to provide? I met his eyes steadily. I'm 29 years old. I'm not a little girl, and I'm not ungrateful. I'm clear-headed for the first time in years. Those weren't legitimate questions. That was an interrogation designed to make him feel inferior. And it worked, not because he is inferior, but because you're also convinced of your own superiority, that you can't recognize value in anything that doesn't mirror your narrow definition of success. My mother stood now, her composure finally cracking. I will not be spoken to this way in my own home. If you cannot show respect, then leave. Both of you. Her voice shook with rage barely contained. This is what happens when you date beneath you. He's turned you against your own family. I wanted to scream at the injustice of it. He hadn't turned me against anyone. They'd done that themselves with years of criticism and conditional love and impossible expectations. Daniel had just helped me see clearly what had always been true. We're leaving, I said, my voice steadier now. And we're not coming back for Easter or Mother's Day or any other commanded performance. I'm done pretending this is a normal family that actually cares about each other. You care about appearances and achievements and maintaining your perfect image. But you don't care about me. Not really. Not the person I actually am. I grabbed Daniel's hand. He hadn't said a word during the entire confrontation, just stood beside me with quiet support. We moved toward the door, and no one tried to stop us physically, but the words kept coming. You'll regret this, my father called out. When you're struggling, when reality sets in, don't come crying to us. Natalie added, this is so typical of you, Lily. Running away when things get hard instead of dealing with reality. But I wasn't running away. For the first time in my life, I was running toward something, toward honesty, toward authentic relationship, toward a life built on my values instead of their expectations. Patricia's voice rose above the others. Your mother is right. Men like Daniel are fine for fun, but marriage is different. You need stability, security. I paused at the door, turning back one final time. You're also convinced that money equals security, that expensive things equal a good life. But I've watched you for 29 years, and none of you seem happy. You're all stressed and competitive and constantly trying to one-up each other. Natalie's marriage looks perfect from the outside, but I've seen how Kenneth talks to her, how she works herself to exhaustion trying to prove she can have it all. Derek barely sleeps, barely sees his wife, sacrificing his entire life to meet Dad's expectations. And Mom, you've built this beautiful house and filled it with beautiful things, but you're so busy maintaining appearances that I don't think you even know who you are anymore. The truth of my words hung in the air. For a moment, nobody spoke. I saw something flicker across my mother's face, something that might have been recognition or pain. But then her mask slid back into place and she straightened her shoulders. Get out of my house. Her voice was ice. If you choose to throw away your family for some man you barely know, that's your decision. But don't expect us to be here when it inevitably fails. I nodded slowly. I don't expect anything from you anymore. That's the point. Daniel and I walked out into the cold December evening. The door slammed behind us with finality. I realized I was shaking, adrenaline flooding my system now that the confrontation was over. Daniel wrapped his arms around me and I let myself collapse against him, all the emotions I'd been holding back finally breaking free. I'm so sorry. I sobbed into his chest. I'm so sorry I brought you into that. I never should have made you sit through that nightmare. His arms tightened around me. Don't apologize. I'm glad I saw it. I'm glad I understand now why you were so nervous, why you've been so hesitant to talk about them. We sat in his car for a long moment, neither of us ready to drive yet. My phone started buzzing almost immediately, text messages flooding in. Derek. That was intense. Are you okay? Natalie. You owe Mom an apology. You humiliated the entire family. My mother. I expect you to call when you've calmed down and come to your senses. I turned off my phone without reading the rest. I'd deal with the fallout later. Right now, I just needed to process what had happened, what I'd done, what it meant for my future. Do you regret it? Daniel asked quietly. Standing up to them like that? I thought about the question seriously. Part of me felt guilty, conditioned by years of being told that family came first, that you didn't air dirty laundry, that you maintained the image even if the reality was rotting from the inside. But a larger part felt lighter than I had in years. No, I said finally. I regret that it had to happen that way. I regret that they couldn't just be kind to you, that they couldn't just be happy for me. But I don't regret choosing you over their approval. I should have done it years ago. We drove back to our apartment in silence, both processing the evening. When we got inside, Daniel made tea while I sat on the couch in my coat, still too shocked to move through normal routines. He brought me a mug and sat beside me, his presence solid and reassuring. What happens now? He asked. I shook my head. I don't know. They'll probably expect me to apologize, to admit I was wrong, to come crawling back. That's how it's always worked before. I'd push back, they'd push harder, and eventually I'd cave because being shut out felt worse than being criticized. I sipped the tea, letting the warmth ground me. But I can't do that anymore. I can't keep sacrificing myself to maintain relationships with people who don't actually want to know me. Over the next few days, the messages continued. Some angry, some manipulative, some attempting reconciliation on their terms. My mother left voicemails about how I'd ruined Christmas, how the family was devastated, how I needed to think about someone other than myself for once. Natalie sent long texts about my immaturity and selfishness. My father's assistant called to inform me that my name had been removed from certain financial accounts, a power play designed to remind me what I was giving up. Only Derek's messages seemed genuinely concerned, asking if I was okay, saying he understood even if he didn't agree with how I'd handled it. I didn't respond to any of them. Daniel and I spent Christmas quietly in our apartment, cooking dinner together, watching movies, building traditions that belonged to us instead of performing in someone else's production. It felt strange at first, the absence of chaos and obligation. But gradually, the strangeness gave way to peace. I realized that I'd been carrying the weight of their expectations for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without judgment. In January, I started therapy to process everything that had happened and everything that had been building for years. My therapist helped me understand concepts like enmeshment and conditional love and how families can be systems that perpetuate dysfunction across generations. She validated that choosing to step away wasn't selfish or ungrateful, it was self-preservation. She helped me see that loving people didn't mean accepting their mistreatment, that boundaries weren't punishments but necessities. Derek reached out in February asking to meet for coffee. I agreed, curious what he wanted to say without our parents orchestrating the conversation. He looked tired when I saw him, older than his 27 years. I've been thinking a lot about what you said at Christmas, he began, about how none of us seem happy. You were right. I can't remember the last time I did something just because I wanted to, not because it would impress Dad or advance my career or meet some expectation. We talked for hours, really talked, the way we used to before he'd gotten absorbed into the family system. He wasn't ready to make the changes I had, but he was starting to question. That felt like progress. Natalie called in March, surprising me. Her voice was different, softer, vulnerable in a way I'd never heard. Kenneth and I are in counseling, she said without preamble. After Christmas, after watching you blow up the whole family dynamic, I started thinking about my marriage, about whether I was happy or just successful. Turns out there's a difference. We talked carefully, both of us navigating new territory. She wasn't ready to apologize for Christmas, and I wasn't ready to forgive. But we were talking. It was something. My parents didn't reach out. Their silence was its own communication, a statement that they'd meant what they said. Choose them or lose them. I'd chosen differently, and they were making good on their ultimatum. Some days that hurt more than others. I grieved the parents I'd wished I had, the family I'd wanted us to be. But I didn't regret my choice. Daniel and I grew closer through it all. He'd seen me at my worst, in my most vulnerable moment, and hadn't run. That meant something. By summer, I'd built a life that felt authentically mine. A teaching job I loved, friends who chose me for who I was, a relationship based on mutual respect instead of performance. I still had complicated feelings about my family. Love and anger and grief all tangled together. But I had space now to process those feelings instead of constantly managing their expectations. The 10 seconds that destroyed everything at Christmas had actually created space for something new to grow, something healthier, something real. And in the end, that was worth more than any approval I might have earned by staying small and silent in a system that would never truly see me. Thanks for watching all the way through. Show some love with a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.